Today is Thursday, July 30th, 2026, and today is National Chili Dog Day. Chili dog is one of those foods that feels like it was invented by someone who looked at a perfectly manageable hot dog and said, "You know what this needs? Consequences." It's delicious, it's messy, and if you eat one in a car, you have made a bold personal choice. But I do like that it takes something familiar and adds a layer of chaos, because today has some chaos built into it. First, we stand near New York Harbor when an explosion shakes the city so violently that it damages the Statue of Liberty. Then we see how a cheap little paperback changed the way people bought books, carried books, and eventually even listened to books. And finally, we step into a church in Jamestown where a small group of men held a meeting that helped shape the future of representative government in America. Welcome to Wait, That's Random, This Day in History. I'm C.L. Burns, voice actor, audiobook narrator, and your reasonably calm guide through humanity's long history of strange decisions. In the early morning hours of July 30th, 1916, New York Harbor was quiet. The United States had not yet entered World War I. Europe was already at war, but America was still officially neutral. That did not mean America was untouched by the conflict. Ships were carrying supplies across the Atlantic. Munitions were being stored near the harbor. And those supplies mattered deeply to the nations already fighting. One of those storage sites was Black Tom Island, a man-made piece of land near Jersey City, New Jersey. It was packed with ammunition and explosives waiting to be shipped overseas. And then, in the darkness before dawn, everything changed. A series of explosions tore through the munitions depot. The blast was enormous. People were thrown from their beds. Windows shattered across the area. The shock was felt far beyond the harbor. And for many New Yorkers, the first thought must have been simple panic. Because when the world suddenly erupts before sunrise, you do not immediately know whether you are hearing an accident, an earthquake, an invasion, or the end of everything. The explosion sent debris into the air and lit the sky over the harbor. Buildings were damaged. People were killed and injured. And nearby Bedloe's Island, where the Statue of Liberty stood, was hit by the force of the blast. That's the part that still feels hard to believe. The Statue of Liberty was damaged by a World War I sabotage attack before the United States had even entered the war. And the damage had a consequence that is still with us. The torch has been closed to visitors ever since. Think about that. Millions of people have visited the Statue of Liberty. They have climbed into the pedestal. They have gone up into the crown. They have stood beneath one of the most famous symbols in the world. But the torch? Closed. Not because of something that happened recently. Not because of a modern security change. Because of an explosion in 1916. That is one of those historical details that sounds like it belongs in a trivia book. Except it is attached to one of the most recognizable landmarks on Earth. And it changes the way you look at the statue. Most of us see the Statue of Liberty as a symbol. Freedom, welcome, new beginnings. The postcard version of America. But on July 30th, 1916, it was also standing beside a harbor connected to a world at war. Years later, the explosion would be understood as sabotage. It was not just a terrible accident at a dangerous storage site. It was part of the wider conflict spilling quietly across borders, oceans, and supposedly neutral ground. That's what makes Black Tom so strange. It was huge. It was violent. It affected one of America's most famous landmarks, and yet many people have never heard of it. You can know the Statue of Liberty your entire life and still not know that her torch has been closed for more than a century because of an explosion that shook New York Harbor before dawn. That is exactly the kind of thing that makes me stop and go, wait, what? And from there, July 30th takes a very different turn. Because not everything that changes the world arrives with an explosion. Sometimes it arrives for sixpence. On July 30th, 1935, the first Penguin paperbacks were published. That may not sound dramatic at first, A paperback book is one of the most ordinary objects in the world. You can toss one in a bag, leave it on a nightstand, bend the spine, spill coffee near it, underline a sentence, and not feel like you have ruined some sacred artifact. But that ordinary feeling is exactly the point. Before paperbacks became common, books could be expensive. Hardbacks were beautiful, but they were not always easy for ordinary readers to buy casually. Buying a book could feel like a serious purchase. Penguin helped change that. The idea was simple but powerful. Make good books affordable, portable, and available to people who might not walk into a traditional bookstore. Instead of treating books as luxury objects, Penguin treated them as companions. Something you could pick up at a railway station. Something you could carry in your coat pocket. Something that could travel with you. That was a quiet revolution, because when books became cheaper and easier to carry, reading changes. It moves out of formal spaces. It becomes part of daily life. A book can ride the train with you. It can wait in your lunch bag. It can sit beside you while you travel, work, rest, or escape for a few minutes. And I really love that part of the history, because in a way, Penguin was helping books break out of the places people expected them to stay. They were not just for libraries, not just for shelves, not just for people with enough money to buy expensive editions. They could go with almost anyone. And eventually, that same idea kept evolving. Books moved from hardback to paperback, then to cassette tapes and CDs, then to downloads, then to audiobooks streaming through a phone while someone drives to work, folds laundry, walks the dog, paints a room, or sits in a driveway because the chapter is almost over and they are not ready to get out of the car yet. And that part feels personal to me because I narrate audiobooks. So I spend a lot of time thinking about how words travel from a writer's mind into somebody else's life. Sometimes they travel on a printed page. Sometimes they travel through earbuds. Sometimes they ride along in a car at 6:30 in the morning while someone is just trying to wake up. But the basic idea is the same. A book becomes powerful when it can reach people where they actually are. That's what Penguin understood in 1935. They were not just changing the format of books. They were changing the distance between a reader and a story. They made books easier to find, easier to afford, and easier to carry. And once that door opened, it never really closed. Today, we barely think about it. Of course, books come in different formats. Of course, we can read them, listen to them, download them, borrow them, collect them, or carry hundreds of them in a device smaller than one old paperback. But every everyday convenience has a beginning. Sometimes it's a blast in the harbor that leaves a mark on a national monument, and sometimes it's a small paperback priced for ordinary people, quietly making the world a little easier to read. And if Penguin paperbacks made stories easier to carry, our next moment is about something much heavier. Government, which is not always the word you reach for when you want to keep things light. But on July 30th, 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia, a group of men gathered inside a church for a meeting that would echo much further than they could have imagined. The Virginia colony had been struggling for years. Jamestown was not some polished beginning with marble halls and grand speeches. It was heat, mosquitoes, disease, hunger, arguments over money, labor, land, survival, and who exactly was allowed to make decisions. Early Jamestown was messy, dangerous, and often brutal. But by 1619, something new was taking shape. Instead of every decision coming only from company officials or colonial leaders, representatives from different settlements were chosen to gather and take part in making laws. They were called burgesses. 22 of them met with Governor Sir George Yardley and his council inside the church at Jamestown. And I love that detail, not because it was grand, because it was so practical. They did not gather in a Capitol building. There was no domed chamber, no microphones, no polished desks, no dramatic television coverage with someone saying, "We now go live to Jamestown." They met in the church because that was the place available. And inside that building, in the middle of a struggling colony, they began holding what is often remembered as the first representative legislative assembly in English America. Now, this is one of those moments that needs a little honesty around it. This was not democracy in the way we think of democracy today. It was limited. It was unequal. It excluded most people. It existed inside a colonial system that would become deeply entangled with slavery, land seizure, and power that did not belong equally to everyone. So we shouldn't turn it into a clean little patriotic postcard. But we also shouldn't miss why it mattered. Because tucked inside that imperfect beginning was an idea that would keep growing, changing, arguing with itself, failing, expanding, and being challenged again and again. The idea that people in a community should have some voice in the rules that govern them. That sounds obvious now, but in 1619, in a fragile English colony on the edge of survival, it was not obvious at all. And that's what makes this meeting so interesting. It was small, it was limited, it was full of contradictions, but it became part of a much larger story about representation in America. Not the finished version, not the ideal version. The beginning of a long, unfinished argument. And maybe that's the most honest way to look at it. History rarely gives us perfect beginnings. It gives us messy ones. A harbor explosion that changed how people visit the Statue of Liberty. A cheap paperback that changes how people carry books. A meeting in a Jamestown church that begins a political tradition still being argued over centuries later. And along the way, we also celebrate the birthday of Buddy Guy, born on July 30th, 1936 in Lettsworth, Louisiana. Buddy Guy is one of those musicians whose influence is almost impossible to measure neatly. You can call him a blues guitarist. You can call him a singer. You can call him a showman. But none of that quite captures what happens when he plays. His guitar can whisper, scream, laugh, argue, and break your heart in the same solo. He grew up in Louisiana, eventually made his way to Chicago, and became part of the electric blues tradition that helped shape modern music. And here's the thing about Buddy Guy. Even people who became legends themselves looked to him. Rock guitarists listened. Blues players listened. Audiences listened. Because he played with this raw, unpredictable energy that made the blues feel alive in the room. Not museum music, not background music, not something safely preserved behind glass. Alive. He could bend a note until it sounded like it was talking directly to you. And in a strange way, that fits today too. Because so much of this episode has been about access. Access to a symbol, even when the torch itself is closed. Access to books, when paperbacks made them cheaper and easier to carry. Access to representation, even in an early and deeply limited form. And Buddy Guy reminds us of another kind of access, the kind music gives us. A way into feeling, a way into memory, a way into someone else's pain, joy, humor, survival, and stubborn refusal to go quiet. That's part of why the blues matters. It takes real life, including the hard parts, and turns it into something people can share. What struck me today is that history keeps finding ways to travel. A shockwave travels across a harbor. A paperback travels in someone's pocket. An idea about representation travels through centuries of argument and change. And a guitar note travels from a stage into a full room of people who may not all have the same story, but somehow understand the feeling. Anyway, the next time I see someone balancing a chili dog with too much confidence, carrying a paperback book in a back pocket, or playing music like they mean every note, I'll try to remember that history is always looking for a way to reach us. Sometimes it's through an explosion, sometimes through a book, sometimes through a meeting, and sometimes through 6 strings and the blues. And that reminds me of something Buddy Guy once said. I never wanted to be the best in town. I just wanted to be the best that Buddy Guy could be. If you'd like to explore more of my narration work, projects, or general historical wandering, you can find it all at waitthat'srandom.com. I'm C.L. Burns, and I appreciate you stopping by the timeline for a while. I'll see you tomorrow.